Hello! The other day, I was watching the movie Scarface, which is one of my favorite films, but I noticed this one shot in particular where Al Pacino is standing in a photo booth during what appears to be golden hour. It's obviously lit, however, I noticed something kind of odd. When Al Pacino is walking around, he actually walks into the shadow, there are shadows going across his face at random times, and he's front lit, which is somewhat of a cardinal sin in a lot of cinematography realms. So I thought, why did DP John Alonzo do this? It just kind of boggled my mind for a while as to why a DP would make an image that's not perfectly manicured. And it kind of struck me. You see, in the late 50s and early 60s, film cameras were evolving, which ended up giving us decent film cameras for the first time that were actually somewhat portable. Now, this led to a ton of documentaries being made, but interestingly enough, because of this new style that was being born, Verite, we actually ended up seeing a shift in narrative as well, where narrative films started to use more documentary style in a lot of cases. Now, of course, there are a lot of other factors and pieces at play, but I thought this was kind of an interesting point. John Alonzo was trying to make a more organic, naturalistic image. Now, obviously it was the mid/late 80s, so this style had been around for a while, but for some reason seeing the shot itself made me realize that in the imperfection of this image, it actually ends up connecting you further. Not to mention that this verite realistic style actually ends up adding a layer of beauty in itself, where you can just observe life. Now, I know that does seem a little esoteric and film schooly, so we'll leave that aside for now, but it did end up inspiring me. I decided to do some experiments of my own, in which I try to create a dawn-dusk look while trying to bring in more organic, realistic elements. In my case, I wanted to actually create a fake golden hour so that I didn't have to adhere to the fact that golden hour is only an hour. So I wanted to test my skills and see if I could create a convincing golden hour look-alike without having to actually shoot during golden hour. In my goal of trying to look naturalistic, I ended up using two different things. One of them is called a cucoloris, and it is basically a thing that you can mount to a stand, which you shoot light through, that basically ends up giving you patterns and texture within the light. You can have cucolorises that are leaf-shaped, or window-shaped, or really whatever you want to create. You can also buy them, and that's another option. However, in this case, I wanted to go really cheap, so I made mine out of strips of wood and hot glue. So literally the cheapest you could possibly go. The other thing I used was actually the thing that's right behind me, a plant. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but essentially I used a light blasting through the leaves to create shadows on the walls that would actually react to the wind. So it was a very organic setup. So let's take a look at each setup. But before we do, if you have the time and find this video helpful, a like is very much appreciated. Also, if you want to see more like this, a subscription is also very much appreciated. But if not, the dislike button works extra well if you hit it twice. Okay, so now onto the setups. The first setup we did was an overhead shot that we ended up shooting at night. For golden hour or dawn-dusk recreations, you really want to think about the location of the sun. Generally, during this time, you're going to have very long shadows and very warm color temperatures. So what we did is we ended up using the Nanlite FS300, which is actually the key we're using here as well, and we put it outside the window with a Fresnel attachment. Now we put the Fresnel out there on full flood with CTO in front of it. Next we hung a DIY cookie that I made out of strips of wood and hot glue. So something super temporary that I could tear apart at the end and remake later if I really wanted to. Keep in mind, during this time of day, you really do want to have the light low to mimic the location of the sun as we talked about before. So we kept the light height kind of low so that we could get those longer shadows. I actually ended up adding an Amaran 200D just pointed right up at the ceiling. This provides a nice soft source, and basically the point of this was just to lift the shadows a tiny bit. We actually end up bringing the shadows back down later in post, but now they're significantly less noisy. The last thing we want to do with another light is cast more shadows, so watch out if you end up using a second light for this setup. As far as the camera goes, we had it mounted on a jib with a 21mm lens, as well as a half black Pro Mist filter in front of the lens. This kind of lessens our contrast while softening some of those sharp edges, especially in the highlights, which I end up liking personally. I think it's a nice look. I was really trying to aim for more of a filmic, vintagey look, so that's why I added it. Finally, I did a quick grade to bring up the warm temperature and clean up some of the skin tones. Now again, for the second setup, we used the FS300 with the Fresnel attachment on the front of it and basically blasted it through some plants. This was one of them. So for this setup, we also had a full CTO gel over the light. Now the reason we blasted it through this plant as well as one other was to make it look like the sunlight was going through some foliage before it was getting to us. I ended up putting the light on the far 3/4 side away from the camera, so that way I could get a far side key that is nicely broken up and also achieve a rim light on the subject that separates from the dark background. So jumping back to the foliage, one thing I noticed is if I was only using one plant, the sharpness of the projected shadows on the wall were actually significantly different on each side of the door. What I did to remedy this issue was actually I got a second plant and put it in the way as well and put it closer to the wall, which gave me the harder edged shadows that are smaller and more similar to the shadows on the first side. See, the thing I was trying to solve here is you wouldn't have multiple shadow sizes if you were using the sun because it's so far away. Basically, everything is going to have a very similar shadow unless the object itself that you're projecting through is dramatically different in distance. But that's not the case here, and that wasn't the look I was going for. So I found the 2-plant solution worked somewhat okay. If I were to do it again, I would either get 2 of the same plant so I could get 2 of the same leaf sizes, or more realistically, I'd probably just use a Cuculoris, which would end up saving the plants from some unneeded heat and would provide a more consistent look. One of the nice things about using actual plants though, is they actually swayed in the wind, which was a really nice effect. So maybe in the future use fake plants? I don't know, I would have to do some more experimentation, but maybe something to think about. On the near side to the camera, what I ended up using was the ultra cheap 40x40 shiny board. And this is actually a DIY reflector I made myself, which I talked about a few videos back. I think it's up there. Now, what I ended up doing with the 40x40 shiny board is I used it to kind of boost up some of the shadows and just kind of add a little bit of a fill, which I thought ended up working out nicely. Now, again, I ended up putting a half black Pro Mist filter on the front of the camera. I thought it ended up really softening the highlights in a nice way and giving the image an overall slight glow, which I appreciated, being that it was supposed to be magic hour. And finally, the key to this specific look was to position the camera in just the right way. So I ended up positioning it kind of diagonal from the wall, and the point was to get as much depth in the shot as possible without getting outside of the beam from the Fresnel fixture. Now, also, the shot was pretty far from perfect. So basically, if you look in the windows or in the door behind me, both of those rooms are basically pitch black, which if it was during the day, they wouldn't necessarily be pitch black unless I had maybe blackout curtains up. So if you're gonna do something like this, maybe add some lights in there or try to shine some lights in through some separate windows that are off screen to bring up the light in a super naturalistic way. But obviously story is king, so match it to whatever narrative or doc style or whatever you're going for. So that's how I mimicked Magic Hour with minimal light setups, while also trying to bring in characteristics that I saw in Scarface. I'd be curious to know if any of you guys have actually faked Magic Hour. It's kind of a fun exercise and, you know, something probably worth doing, so let me know. If you have any favorite Magic Hour shots that either you shot or from a movie, also let me know down below. I'd love to talk about some beautiful imagery. And always keep in mind, there really is no wrong answer. Cinematography is an incredibly subjective thing, and between the director and cinematographer, they're gonna pick the best image for what they think represent their ideas. As always, if you have the time and enjoyed the video, a like is very much appreciated. If you want to see more, a subscription is also very much appreciated. And I hope you learned something. I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.